The live stream is now on, so please take your seat, and I note that most of you actually have done so. Thank you. Excellencies, Minister Valtonen, President Niemelä, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Foreign Ministry, I want to welcome you all to this first inaugural Helsinki Roundtable on International Security. As I mentioned, we also have a lot of followers online, so welcome to all of you also. My name is Stefan Lindström. I work as the Ambassador of Technology at the Foreign Ministry of Finland on tech issues, how it affects foreign and security policy. We are now at Dipoli, which is a remarkable building, not only from the wonderful architecture of Raili and Reima Pietilä, but also from a historical perspective. Because in this very room, where we are standing and sitting right now, this is where in 1973, the first phase of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, was held here. And my suggestion is that let's build on that spirit, on that path, for a fruitful conclusion on a topic that is actually more timely than ever. The background of this gathering is, of course, that artificial intelligence today is transforming international security, creating opportunities and challenges in global power dynamics. Countries are competing to leverage AI for military, economic and societal advantages, but also struggling to cover the risks. Corporations are driving the change at an exceptional pace. At the same time, the rules-based multilateral system is struggling to play a meaningful role in this development. This all requires addressing technology as an integral part of foreign and security policy, balancing all these various aspects at play. Closer cooperation between all stakeholders is needed to build competence, above all resilience, capacity to act. And closer cooperation between like-minded countries is needed. A few thoughts to consider with regard to this. The first is something that struck me while I was in Washington 3 weeks ago at the Global Security Forum. And it's really that when you think about it, the most powerful tools that mankind has ever created, like nuclear weapons, for instance, has always been governed by a global system that we all had been adhering to, with a good result, because nothing has actually never taken place. But now we are in a situation where advanced artificial intelligence, with all its capabilities, spearheaded by the private sector, with all its potential effects, is in the hands of every individual, everywhere in the world, anytime. And this is a huge paradigm change when you think about it. Secondly, it's really the ongoing transition changes brought forward by the relationship between politics and technology. We talk about science becoming a critical competitive asset and a source of geopolitical power. We talk about emerging technologies. We talk about the underlying geography of value chains and companies that need to navigate this incredibly complex situation in a totally new way. And the last question that really struck my mind when preparing for this is sort of that we are now entering the second quarter of the 21st century. Talking about quarter economics is, of course, always popular when we have stock-listed company CEOs on the scene. But will this second quarter be a hegemonic battle between the great powers, US and China, or the EU? Or will it be a hegemonic battle between the concept of a national state and tech companies? Also something that you didn't think about a few years back. But to address all these questions and many more, we will hear opening remarks from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Elina Valtonen, followed by 3 conversations looking at the role of governments and companies, the international security implications, and the science and economics of artificial intelligence. They will feature some great minds from the worlds of policy, business, and science, and we encourage you also to contribute to the discussion. The sessions will be moderated by Dan Michaels, who is the Brussels bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, who will introduce the panelists later on. But before we are entering into the panels, I give the word to the president of Aalto University, Ilkka Niemilä, to offer a few words of welcome as well. Ilkka.
Thank you. Thank you. Your Excellencies, Minister Valtonen, esteemed guests present here in Dipoli, but also those following the event online. As the President of Aalto University, it's my great pleasure to warmly welcome you all to this Helsinki Roundtable on AI and International Security. There's another way also, a perspective why it's very fitting that this event takes place here on our campus in Otaniemi. Aalto University has been involved in AI research since the very early days of the field. In fact, pioneering work on neural networks was initiated over 40 years ago here in Otaniemi by Professor academician Teuvo Kohonen. And as you might know, neural networks are a fundamental part of the now dominating deep learning technology. We have had a continuous series of national centers of excellence in research on AI here in Otaniemi since the 90s. And now we run the national flagship program on AI, the Finnish Center for Artificial Intelligence, together with the University of Helsinki and VTT. And just a few months ago, Ellis Institute Finland was established as a leading hotspot in the Ellis network of major AI research hubs in Europe, further testifying Finland's position as a leading nation in AI. Dear guests, in recent years, AI has seen tremendous advancements. And at the same time, we're witnessing rapid geopolitical changes that impact international relations and security issues. Science and technology have become critical competitive assets and perhaps a significant source of geopolitical power. Here, AI, as general purpose enabling technology that enhances other technologies and areas, has become critically important. This calls for major investments in research and education efforts around AI to make sure that, for example, nations remain competitive and have the capabilities to create critical knowledge and competencies to apply AI widely. These changes also influence scientific research. The scientific community is increasingly aware of the need to ensure and enhance research security. And we're actively addressing these concerns. At the same time, research is inherently international and open. Research knows no boundaries or borders. Researchers often move across countries as part of their academic career. This international exchange is essential and must be maintained. Reconciling the need for security with principles of openness and international collaboration might seem contradictory. However, I believe that by addressing security concerns, we can better ensure the openness and international nature of our work, the quality of our research, and our overall preparedness. Therefore, I'm very delighted that Aalto University is co-hosting this timely and intriguing roundtable on AI and international security with such distinguished guests and speakers. We have a very, very exciting program ahead of us. And to get this program started, I have a great pleasure to invite on stage Minister for Foreign Affairs Elina Valtonen to give her opening remarks. Minister Valtonen, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is a profound honor to welcome you all to the Helsinki Roundtable on Artificial Intelligence and International Security. Today we have gathered an exceptional group of thought leaders and decision makers from across policy, business and research, each of you bringing unique insights from different corners of the world. I extend my deepest gratitude to Aalto University for co-hosting and co-organizing this event with the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and to all our esteemed speakers, many of whom have traversed great distances to be here. Your presence underscores the significance of the topic we are here to discuss. And even happier am I, of course, to welcome you to my alma mater. I have graduated back in the day from Helsinki University of Technology and also from the Helsinki School of Economics, these days Aalto University. And this building reminds me of so many parties we had back in the day, so I'm so certain that we will have just as much fun today. And AI indeed has been very close to my heart from the early days of my career. While working in the financial sector, I programmed my first neural network and wrote my master's thesis based on it. The title was Forecasting the Term Structure of Interest Rates with an Error-Adjusting Neural Network. This was almost exactly 20 years ago. Since then, AI has become not just a niche experiment for self-made nerds like myself, but a revolution indeed on the entire society and our culture, which has and will have profound effects on how we work, interact, and think, but also on, on privacy, the security of our societies, and on international relations. To that end, it is imperative that we address AI's implications for international security, harness its immense potential to develop our competitive edge, and ensure that its governance aligns with our shared values. Allow me to share some reflections to spark what I'm certain will be a compelling and enlightening conversation. First, on international security. The race for technological supremacy is already redrawing the geopolitical map. Both democratic and authoritarian states are investing heavily in AI to gain strategic advantage, both in the physical world and in the digital sphere. AI's ability to process vast amounts of data, combined with increasing computational power and ever-evolving algorithms, is driving extraordinary progress. On one hand, AI is fueling economic growth, enhancing productivity, and contributing to sustainable development, while robust computation requires masses of electricity. On the other, it introduces complex security risks ranging from technical challenges like closed versus open models to ethical concerns over mass surveillance, social manipulation, and the erosion of human control. From a defense perspective, AI's dual-use nature presents both opportunities and threats. While AI strengthens our ability to detect and respond to threats, it also lowers the barrier for malicious actors to conduct more sophisticated and rapid attacks. AI-enabled systems can make battlefield decisions quicker and more accurately. They can improve intelligence and targeting. In modern warfare, with new types of drones, autonomous vessels, and easier access to missile technology, the speed and quality of decision-making is increasingly the decisive factor. We have already witnessed AI's impact on modern warfare in Ukraine and in Gaza. This reality reinforces an urgent need. We must master AI's role in defense and security today so that we are prepared for the challenges of tomorrow. Moreover, we must ensure that AI is always employed in accordance with international human rights and humanitarian law. As Finns, we firmly believe that security is inseparable from technological and economic growth. The more resilient and advanced our own capabilities are, the better positioned are we to safeguard our security and influence global rulemaking. At the same time, we must actively work to reduce harmful dependencies in supply chains and enhance our resilience in times of crisis. A couple of words on competitiveness. As the rapid adoption of AI systems such as ChatGPT, or like our Nobel laureate Bengt Holmström calls him Charlie, and DeepSeek has shown, AI is evolving at an astonishing pace. The race is far from over, and it is critical that we empower our researchers and businesses to remain at the forefront, not just as participants, but as standard setters shaping the future. Europe boasts a strong research foundation, and innovation flourishes best when academia and industry work hand in hand. Finland is host to promising AI startups that require not only the right regulatory environment, but also investment conditions that enable them to scale. Both the public and private sectors must do better in integrating AI to modernize operations, boost productivity, and demonstrate successful applications of the technology. Yet we must also acknowledge a pressing concern. Europe risks lagging behind its key competitors in AI-driven economic growth. The global economy is increasingly fueled by data, and while the EU has a fast-growing data economy, we must claim a larger share of the global market. AI is not just a tool, it is the key to unlocking Europe's potential. To truly lead, we must prioritize access to world-class research infrastructure, robust datasets, advanced models, and first and foremost, top-tier talent. Training AI at scale demands significant computing capacity, an area where closer collaboration between the public and private sectors is essential. The recently launched Open Euro LLM initiative marks a crucial step in advancing open source AI capabilities in Europe. Furthermore, Finland is already home to cutting-edge, eco-efficient data centers powered by abundant green energy and integrated into circular economy systems. Here, AI can be developed responsibly, sustainably, and with a clear vision for the future. In many ways, setting up an AI company is similar to setting up a company. Tech or no, a competitive business environment needs to provide capital as well as human capital and no excessive regulatory burdens or taxes for managing these. And finally, a few words on governance. It is often said that while others innovate, the EU regulates. Yet ensuring that technology aligns with our values and interests is not a hindrance only. It is a necessity and in some instances also a competitive advantage. Strengthening AI governance is paramount, requiring continuous evaluation of AI models, standardization and industry-wide certification to enhance security. While AI's development is driven by academia and the private sector, its regulatory framework must be shaped through democratic processes. The greater AI's societal impact, the more essential it is to foster international cooperation to ensure responsible development and deployment. At the end of the day, it's the freedom of people that is at stake. Europe's vision for AI governance is rooted in fundamental principles: human centricity, democracy, the rule of law, security and sustainability. We embrace technological progress while standing firmly by our values. Finland exemplifies this approach not only in words but also in action. However, AI and its risks recognize no borders. Technology advances at a pace that often outstrips politics, making global policy alignment essential. This is why international cooperation on AI governance through forums such as the AI Summit process, the G7, the OECD, and the United Nations is so crucial. A rules-based international system serves all of us, but it requires collaboration across governments, industry, and academia. As we navigate this technological frontier, closer cooperation among democratic nations is particularly vital. Together, we can ensure that AI is developed and governed in a way that safeguards freedom and counters authoritarian influence in global forums. Ladies and gentlemen, Finland has long recognized the significance of AI. Back in 2017, we were among the first countries to launch a national AI strategy, and today, AI remains a top priority for our government. As a small but agile nation, we are well positioned to host the most competitive companies, accelerate AI adoption across both the public and private sectors, foster an innovation-friendly regulatory environment, and cultivate an AI-literate society built on trust and transparency. In this very spirit of shared purpose, it is my great privilege to convene and engage with all of you today. My hope is that through this roundtable, we can forge a common understanding of the challenges ahead and work together for solutions and all the opportunities at hand. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Madam Minister. You touched on a lot there that I'm sure we're going to come back to over the next couple of hours. And I can't help but wondering how many of your counterparts you can geek out with discussing neural networks, coding, and interest rates. So must make foreign minister meetings interesting. Before we dive into questions, I just want to quickly introduce a panel that I know it's a cliche, doesn't need an introduction. But Pekka Lundmark is the CEO of Nokia, soon to be former CEO. And the one thing I'll say about Nokia is, as Pekka, I'm sure will say, that it doesn't make handsets anymore, is involved in a lot of other areas that do touch on AI. And Peter Sarlin, who is a co-founder of Silo AI, now part of AMD, which is an exceptionally international AI company. And Peter can talk a bit more about the company and his first-hand frontline perspective on AI. I want to thank the organizers for having me here. It's an honor and a pleasure. I'm based in Brussels, where we think these days probably obsessively about international security and increasingly about AI, but don't always bring the two topics together. And I think it's great to bring these issues together front and center. And what better place than Finland and this building to be doing it. So, Madam Minister, maybe to jump in, you talk about some of the challenges ahead, but broadly speaking, are we ready to make the choices needed that we are facing and will face on privacy versus security, on investments, and just the tough choices that AI presents us with?
Well, that is indeed, I guess, the most burning question, because indeed, to an extent where Europe has really mastered in regulating things, which, as I said, is not only a bad thing, because of course the reason why politicians in democratic nations decide to regulate something is because it's thought that it's for the common good, right? So there is, of course, a good reason behind it. But at the same time, we do experience now that, for instance, adopting some language models which have been, for instance, developed in the US is either completely impossible to bring them to Europe, or it happens at, after some time, say even 6 months can be a very significant time lag in development, especially if you want to be cutting edge. So it is really a question about how we compromise and how we achieve this balance. And really, if we think about, for instance, the early days of the internet, if there had been regulation before, then probably there wouldn't be any, or there wouldn't be an internet, right? So it's really tough. But I think how to solve this is that, of course, at the end of the day, the individual, him and herself, should have the full ownership of his data or her data and her actions in relation. And at the same time, the regulatory environment should make room for that individual choice and not make choices on her behalf. Because that is when it becomes too cumbersome, and also that is also in contradiction to our free society and the thinking which is fundamental to democracies.
I think we're going to come back to a lot of those points. Pekka, Nokia in the world of tech these days is an old company, and I think most people don't associate it with AI. So maybe could you give us some perspective on where does AI come into your business and intersect?
Sure. Well, short answer is that AI is changing everything in what we do, and I'll explain. Before that, let me say that for me personally, also attending an AI event here on this campus is very much like a homecoming, because I actually did study neural networks here in the 80s already, and now we are seeing that finally it is what the theories said already then is coming through. And yes, this very hall where we are now was one of the greatest party venues that we had at that time. Nokia obviously delivers connectivity, and not only connectivity, but trusted connectivity, and that word trusted is extremely important in today's world. We often talk about the holy trinity between AI, cloud, and connectivity. Without high-quality, trusted connectivity, AI will not be able to deliver. And this is really where Nokia comes in. And this is, since we are now attending a European event, it's very important to keep in mind that there are not many technology areas where Europe is actually leading compared to the US, but connectivity is one of those. That is something that we have to leverage in Europe. When I said that AI is changing everything, let me give you a couple of examples. AI is going inside every network element that we deliver. We are implementing AI capabilities in the chipsets that we design, so that the chipset can with the help of AI, recognize that okay, now there is a malicious distributed denial of service attack starting, and it can stop it inside the router that we deliver. That's kind of in the very, very core of the technology. AI is making the network better, more resilient. You can automate the network with the help of AI. Operators who are running the networks, they will be able to significantly improve their capabilities in their customer service, in fault detection, and basically in the automation of how they deliver all their services. So it delivers a significant productivity improvement to operators through the technologies that we enable. And then perhaps even more importantly, AI helps the network become self-aware and self-learning. So we will not anymore need to be able to code everything into the radio base stations or into the routers or everything. The network elements will gradually be learning themselves how to behave in different situations. And final point, we invested last year over 4 billion euros in R&D. AI is already now significantly improving R&D productivity through different types of AI agents and AI assistants that developers are using. And remember, if you invest over 4 billion in R&D, 1% productivity improvement would be over 40 million. 10% productivity improvement over 400 million, but what if that productivity improvement goes first to 10%, then to 20, 30, 40, 50, and so
on? Peter, you live and breathe AI. What would you say, what do people not get about AI and its impact on the world around us?
Yeah, that's a very broad question, of course. And in front of this audience, I think Ilkka highlighted well in the very beginning the background that Helsinki and Aalto has in AI, and I would entirely agree. I think like Minister Valtonen and Pekka, I've also worked on neural networks. I've actually been a sort of beneficiary of the Kohonen era, worked on a PhD adding temporality to neural networks. Not that much time spent on partying at that point of my career.
We did that with Pekka Naakka.
But
so even the nerds of neural networks did some partying here back then.
Even that, yeah. No, so, and then I think it was worth noting that Finland actually also had a researcher called Seppo Linnanmaa, who most likely would have received the Nobel laureate if he would have still been alive last year. But nevertheless, when it comes to AI, I think we have an audience that understands the sort of the technology and the key concepts. I thought I'd still open up my perspective to this. There's a lot of talk today about superintelligence and AGI, and when we're reaching that, my personal take has been throughout and continues to be that we don't know, and the technology we have today is narrow AI, and I think this doesn't come without risk and doesn't come without opportunity. I think the biggest risk we have at the moment happening comes due to the fact that we have technology and we have AI that fulfills the so-called Turing test. And what that means is that we as human beings cannot distinguish machines from other human beings. And eventually, I mean, even though I am saying that the technology we have is narrow AI, however you define. I think the best way to actually reach AGI today is by sort of changing the definition of AGI. But what is happening is that we are adding more and more horizontal capability to AI technology, and we're adding more and more vertical capability, what oftentimes is called agents today. And AI is just becoming a part of everything from network equipment to mobile devices, cars, lawn mowers, vacuum cleaners, and drones, and other types of products out there. And I do think then it becomes sort of a security question and topic, and also a labor policy topic, and so forth.
Minister Valtonen, one of the comments you made was talking about Finland and its role in this place. In something as inherently international as AI, can one country make a difference?
Well, an individual can make a difference, so certainly, and very much so. And also, since, well, of course, Finland is a member in the European Union, we also, try to bring our influence also to the decision making in Europe. But having said this, I think one of the setbacks for essentially not just AI but software in general in Europe, why we are lagging behind is that we are such a fragmented market, and not just in a good way fragmented, because of course political competition is also an asset. It's not only a bad thing, and to an extent that also exists in the United States, where you have some differences across the states. But I guess the main issue is that if you are setting up a company, then what you require is first and foremost, of course, the talent. So you would need to have an environment where you can easily hire, but also get rid of people if they are not suitable for the task, and especially during the early phases of a company, even one, misrecruitment can be very significant to the overall fate of the company, even in very high tech companies. But also the regulation in terms of how you can say grant options, stock options, how that is treated across countries, because that varies in Europe. I mean, there's not one single way of doing that. And the smaller the company is, the bigger the burden is. You would essentially need a larger legal department than people in really creating the substance. So there's a lot we can do on this side. Well, Finland is of course not perfect, but as a market actually better equipped than many other larger European countries. And I think we should, as Europe, become a little bit more like Finland in this regard. But of course, one of the main problems in Finland is, of course, a very high tax burden, because that translates into the fact that you wouldn't have as much capital, because, of course, capital is needed very much as well. And we, of course, live in an international environment where we can, you can be an American investor or whoever and come here and invest, and that happens. But it would, of course, be great if Finns themselves could also be more active as owners as well. And this applies to the rest of Europe as much as well.
I think those are points we're going to come back to in one of our later panels in a lot greater depth. But picking up on some of the business issues, Pekka, Peter, you're talking about international security. Traditionally, that's been a field quite separate from business. But evidently, AI makes it inescapable. So from a business perspective, what is the intersection of business and international security that AI brings into focus? I mean, obviously some of the technologies, we see in drones, your networks, but, maybe bring us a little closer to how you see it.
Yeah, obviously we are a business, we are not a political player, but what we are seeing is that when you deliver connectivity and when you marry AI with connectivity, you are actually facing a lot of kind of geopolitical considerations all the time, and you just, as a business, you just cannot avoid it. We've been thinking hard that what is kind of, I explained a little bit that what is our right to play, and we are expanding to new sectors that have even greater connection to international security, like communications or connectivity platforms for the military and defense industry and so on, which is something that is going to be really important for Europe, and Nokia is planning to be part of that. But from a little bit broader perspective, I would say that the big opportunity that Europe has in this, and we need to position ourselves so that we find the places where to compete, because it will be very difficult to go head on hand against the American internet giants. The big opportunity for Europe, which has a connection to the security question, is really industrial AI and industrial applications of AI. As I said, Europe is leading in connectivity, and Europe is also leading in many, many industrial sectors. So if we find a way to marry connectivity, industrial data and then security solutions for how to apply that data, then I believe that Europe will have a chance to find its own place in the world and define its competitive advantage against both China and the US.
Peter, you come at this, I think, from a slightly different perspective, being a pure AI company. So what's your take on the business entry point to international security via AI?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you could touch upon this from many perspectives. I mean, you could take this as a sovereignty question, and AI, of course, means many things. Again, I mean, it's everything from drones to chatbots, and there's a lot in between. But I mean, I think if you more broadly look at this wave, it is one of the sort of first significant technology waves that has not been driven by public sector, in the same way as, say, internet or space technology and so forth. And I do think that it's sort of first and foremost, it's sort of a competitiveness question. If we are to compete in Finland or in Europe, we need to ensure that we have competitive companies that are building this technology. And that takes many things. I mean, we've touched upon the need for talent and the need for compute, the need for capital and so forth. So I think that's a broader discussion. But eventually, if Europe does not have leading companies in this space, then I don't really see a way sort of for Europe to develop state-of-the-art technology.
Okay. I'm going to come to the audience for a question or two in a minute, so please, folks, think about what you want to ask the panel. You mentioned sovereignty, and obviously it's a big topic. Minister Valtonen, I mean, among foreign ministers, sovereignty is one of your responsibilities, but how do you marry that with something as international as AI?
Well, that's a tough question. I guess you need to look at what's behind the concept of sovereignty, and I guess in an optimal world and in democracies, what is behind sovereignty is the people's possibility to choose their own fate and really make decisions in their own life concerning themselves. And sovereignty of a nation is there to protect that very possibility of the people to do that. So, therefore, it's important that we are able to also in the digital space and in AI to really, at the end of the day, protect this fundamental right of people to make their own decisions, but also decisions with regards to, say, the privacy of their data and the way of life. And this is very much something which eventually will be at stake. It's already at stake to a degree. So therefore, it's very important that also on foreign ministers level or foreign policy level that we increasingly also talk technology really, which goes hand in hand with these fundamental principles of how our life is organized. And at the end of the day, if we are not competitive, like Peter says, if we are not, competitive enough to the degree that we would have companies who do have the competitive advantage and those most successful ones, and if we're just adopting somebody else or someone else's technology, then I think that might lead to being an impediment to our sovereignty.
Pekka, you bump up against sovereignty issues in some of your biggest competitors are from very different countries, your customers and overseas. How is the increasing role of AI playing into that?
Into the sovereignty question,
yeah,
especially. It is, what we are clearly seeing is that our customers get a lot of questions from their customers. We are delivering mostly to operators and some public sector applications, and they are all getting questions, both network operators and data center operators. They are getting a lot of questions from their customers that if we trust our data, if I'm a corporation and I want to trust my data on this data center operator or this network operator, how can you assure me that that data will be always safe? And that is having then a direct connection to the positioning that Nokia has in this whole ecosystem, because we deliver that trusted connectivity technology. So this whole question of trustworthiness and sovereignty and trusted access to data is actually turning to a competitive advantage to Nokia in this pretty tricky world situation.
Fascinating. And Peter, you, if I understand it correctly, almost help promote sovereignty in a way that a lot of you're focused on different languages and very international uses of AI. Maybe could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, and in line with that, Minister Valtonen already kindly highlighted the Open Euro initiative that we are involved in, which is specifically focusing on open source multilingual language models, and where we have actually 4 out of 24 organizations are from Finland, and we are co-leading that initiative. So Finland is well represented in many ways. I think that is extremely important. And what we are doing there is basically a continuation to the efforts that we've been doing on the Finnish Lumi supercomputer during the past 2 years. So we released the first multilingual model that covers low resource language Finnish and English and programming languages early last year, and then we've released a model that covers all Nordic languages and English and programming languages, and now we are in the process of releasing Europa, which includes all European languages, and it implies that it's natively trained on these low resource languages that are otherwise not represented particularly well in these models. And I think I do think that's a sovereignty question. I do think it's crucial for Europe. I would call this more of an AI infrastructure, digital infrastructure. They're fully open source. Anyone can eventually tap into them. I would actually say that it's beyond sort of a values and cultures question. I think it's really a commercial question, because when you can tap into open source models, you can eventually sort of build your own products on top of them. But what I mean, eventually, in line with why we are doing this, but also in line with sort of how we should think about this overall, AI is machine learning is neural networks, and neural networks are just function approximators. We're talking about AI as if it would be sort of magic. It is basically capable of approximating any function, yes, but it is approximating the function that we teach it to approximate, and that we do with data. So eventually it becomes a data question. What is the data? What is the unique data that European companies or Finnish companies have, which allows them to create better machine learning and AI? And I think that is the path to sovereignty, and eventually that takes you to competitiveness.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to turn to the audience. If anybody here has a question for the panel, I think we have a microphone somewhere. Gentleman here holding up if you could identify yourself, please.
Petri Mehonen. So I'm actually from Aalto University. So I have one question which can go to anyone or all in a panel, which is under the title speed, because correctly there has been a discussion about need of the capital taxation, etc. But I think the one of the strength also in some other economical areas is capability of making very rapidly decisions, whether it's in markets, companies, but especially governments. And if I look the Europe overall, it seems that we really love to think a lot. We need to have a talk shops a lot, and we make right decisions, but they come a little bit later. Is there the way to go a little bit faster and what we would need. And as a recognition, I might be biased with my view in Europe. 18 years in Germany and last 3 years in Finland. These are very consensus-driven and little bit slow countries. But still, it feels that speed is something we are not discussing enough.
It's a very relevant question these days, where one can really see the difference in speed, say, between Brussels and Washington. Minister Valtonen, I think that one is for you at least first.
Yes, and I would start by saying that in a democracy, slowness to a degree is not a fault, it's a feature. And it's there to protect, again, the individual. But having said this, of course, what should be discussed is to which level we really should regulate the individual's ability to make those choices, which I talked about earlier. And I think we are currently over-regulating. So if there was a framework which would allow for a little bit more risk-taking, but again, protect the individual, and I think this is the European model, where we, at the end of the day, we take care of the individual if something happens. You know, if you start a company, it fails, you try to do something else, or you train for one career, and then because of AI, it also, you know, this pace also will increase massively, that you will have to retrain and all of this, so that we really take care of the individual too. I think this is a fantastic combination. But we should a little bit less perhaps limit the space of opportunities that people have. And this, of course, translates into the opportunities that companies have for risk-taking. And therefore, I think these new initiatives the European Commission has at least been vocal about, and is all in the programs, which Finland is also very much promoting, very much according to our government program as well, is that we should reduce the level of regulation and really concentrate on fundamental issues, and basically reduce the layer of bureaucracy, especially that burdens or comes as a burden for companies, no matter small or large. So starting with that, but otherwise I think the democratic system is at least the best one I've seen.
Pekka,
well,
speed?
That is a fantastic question, because that is the question to produce an answer to, because clearly Europe is not moving fast enough, not anywhere nearly fast enough. We started to talk about, remember, industrial digitalization and industrial internet, and Germans invented the Industry 4.0 like 20 years ago. Not enough has happened after that, and now when I mentioned that Europe's big opportunity is industrial AI, it is just the next version of industrial internet. Now we talk about industrial AI, which is one approximation level higher. There is still a big chance, but the reality is that European companies in the past 5 to 10 years have been faced by a regulatory tsunami, and this trend must change, and it must change quickly. I think it's very good that the new Commission is now clearly recognizing that there is an issue, and they are saying that they are committed to changing it. So now it is up to then the implementation, that will it happen. One example is the AI Act, which was mentioned, and the minister also here, and the intentions are very good there. Responsible AI and all that stuff, but now the big test will be in the implementation in the member states, that how is it going to be implemented? Is it going to be, again, 27 different implementations, companies confused, capital flowing elsewhere? That's what we need to avoid. And again, if one wants to accept my theory that industrial AI is Europe's big chance, then we need to recognize that we need simple regulation for that, because hey, a turbine in a power plant does not need same type of protection as a human being does when we talk about how to apply data.
Interesting. Peter?
I think I would agree, an extremely good question. And while the the minister and the new commission and others are working on a simpler regulation, which I mean I would agree, as Pekka also highlighted, is something to be concerned with. I do think we actually also need to think about how does Europe actually build something to be regulated, and it's not only sort of regulation that is the problem here. I think we have to think about how are AI investments actually happening, and there's a significant difference in how, for instance, North American companies are investing in this technology compared to how European companies are investing in this technology. And as an example, we came out yesterday, as a matter of fact, with the Nordic State of AI report that for the fourth consecutive year is looking at specifically these topics. And we think somehow that AI is a sort of productivity investment. It gives us efficiency, it saves costs. And that's not how AI is built in most sort of more advanced AI companies or AI-driven companies. It's a revenue opportunity. It's a feature as part of your products. And I think you do those investments in totally different ways. And it doesn't necessarily always come with an ROI calculation that basically gives you the exact number of euros you're saving, but you're building competitive edge and you're building better products.
We have about 5 minutes left. Take one more question, then comes. This is going to be a tough choice. I think I saw this woman here had put her hand up first. Sorry if I saw wrong. So, introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Niina Hyvärinen from Aalto University. I would actually like to maybe pick from this previous question and just kind of follow up on that, and totally agree that industrial AI is something that where we need to start really working on. And the European Commission is saying all the right things at the moment, but the challenge is that how do you actually bridge, if not breaking those silos, but then at least bridging the kind of the policymakers and policymaking and the tech sector and companies? Because very often there still seems to be this divide in between, like somehow not speaking the same language or not understanding each other. What do you feel like, using this very unique opportunity, that what do you feel that you need from each other? Like what would make this discussion easier, and easier actually to get from saying the right things to actually doing something?
Maybe Peter, I'll start with you. And if I could add to that, with AI, a big question is ownership of data. It's one thing we're individuals, but for companies who are so guarded about their data, are they going to be willing to have it fed into some AI model? Well, maybe given the time, we'll close out with this question and finish with the conclude with the minister. So, Peter, you get that one first.
I mean, as I highlighted earlier, I think data is the key question, and as I've been highlighting throughout, I think for Europe and Finland and the Nordics, it's a competitiveness question, and we can talk about sovereignty, but then eventually the way we reach that is by sort of fostering growth in competitive, like technology investing companies, and for AI to create value, you need to have access to data that others do not have access to, because basically everyone has access to pretty much the same algorithms out there. And hence, in many cases, you would ideally be positioned in the value chain in such a position where you are eventually owning the customer, you're owning the data, and you're creating value to that end customer. And maybe on a little bit of a separate note, I think there is a certain risk that we do not actually succeed in building these technology platforms or scalable digital products and services that are capturing data. But we position in the other end, which, even though we welcome that investment as well, is more focused on producing energy for data centers. And I think there's a tremendous difference in this value chain.
Pekka, what can bridge this divide?
How to bridge the divide? Obviously, it does require a lot of dialogue between the public sector and private sector. And of course, Peter is exactly right when he said that yes, regulation is important, but first we need something to regulate. And this is the classic mistake that Europe often does, is that we start to regulate before anything even is created. And then, well, while everybody's saying that US lets the business grow first and then they regulate if something is about to go wrong. But then the question is that what can the public sector do in Europe? Yes, simplified regulation. We are very far in Europe still from an truly integrated market. We don't have a digital single market. We are behind in investments in digital connectivity, which is a fundamental enabler. Those need to be sped up. And then very importantly, the public sector obviously is ultimately responsible for the education system. And this is going to be a massive reskilling task. Again, if we believe in the industrial AI theory, we are going to need a lot of people that have capabilities and understanding of both AI technologies and then those industries where those technologies are to be applied. Container cranes in ports, power plants, industrial robots, drones, and how to develop skills that are able to combine these two. This is where public sector plays an important role. I believe, of course, that if we have the right conditions for regulation, financing, and skills, then I see no reason why European innovation and European companies would not be able to thrive in this era.
Minister Valtonen, as a former business person, now involved in policy, I guess you get the final word on this topic.
Yes, well, I guess this is a very fundamental and philosophical question, a very important one. I guess it boils down to which degree, public sector decision makers or politicians do understand what the private sector really is about and what should be the fundamental issue really that we should be, concentrating on. And this not only applies to regulation on AI, because of course AI companies are affected by all sorts of regulation because essentially the companies live in the real world and the people do. But at least my thinking as a political decision maker has always been that I will try to reduce my thinking to, instead of protecting companies or industries or regions or whatever, a larger conglomerate of things, we should protect people. Which leads to the fact that, for instance, we wouldn't need to regulate so much how, say, an industrial robot, for instance, acts if it's not directly affecting the data of a human being or how human life is interacted with. And that also applies to, say, to weapon systems, because if it's lethal, then clearly it has to do with, protecting human lives, right? And this is what we should focus about. So I think we overregulate in the sense that we perhaps try to link the regulation to a specific technology, which we shouldn't be even trying to do. The democratic process, but I would say any regulatory process is made way too slow to try to catch up with technology. So we should basically limit ourselves to essentially regulating the core issues. And this, I think, leads to the fact that democracy is not necessarily handicapped against other quicker decision-making processes where you just ask one person. But how do we get to that point is a different thing, and it will take time, even though the Commission is now really aiming for that. And I think people have really realized that this is also an existential issue, that we remain competitive. And also, finally, I would just like to say that Europe in the past 20 years, I mean, we have, of course, been very competitive in industry and manufacturing. Where we have really now lagged behind, especially in the past 10 years, is in digital services. And now I think all political decision makers should sit down and ask themselves why. And if we are able to really make room for the digital services and especially digital innovation, also linked to manufacturing and industry, so AI for industries especially. I mean, we're back again.
Thank you. Oh, Peter, did you have was there some vital point you wanted to raise?
Now you're raising the bar.
Yeah.
So no, I have to admit that I missed the beginning of the question. But what I just wanted to add was, I previously mentioned data, talent, and compute. I think those are the ingredients for AI, yes. But if you look at the Draghi report and take out the growth in the plus $1 trillion dollar companies in the US, we're actually growing equally slow in both North America and the US. To me, that says that we need to make sure that we're growing these technology companies in Europe. And what I think it takes is more than data, talent, and compute. I think it, especially as also Draghi highlighted, takes a strong single market, a market where you can scale these technology companies. And at the moment, we are extremely fragmented in so many different ways. And if we don't have those, then I think it's going to be difficult to scale technology companies in the region.
That sets us up well for coming conversations. So thanks to the panel. Thank you all. And again, thank you, Minister Valtonen, for getting us all together here.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Will be conducted here in a more of a roundtable format. This is no longer the fireside, so we can put the fire out up there. Our next panel, the panelists are seated here next to me, is on international security implications of AI. We touched on some of those here, but we're going to dig a little deeper now. Everybody has the names of the panelists here, but starting from the far end here is Kajsa Ollongren, who is the former defense minister of the Netherlands, also an interior minister. These will be relevant issues.
It's transmitted live.
Next is Benedicte van Tos, who is the managing director for peace, security, and defense at the European External Action Service. And that mix of peace and defense is an interesting mix these days. Leah Walker, who has come from Berkeley, California, and is the director, if I'm correct, of the Risk and Security Lab there. Also very topical issues. And finally, sitting next to me is John Hultqvist, who is the chief analyst at Mandiant, now part of Google. You have your eyes deep into the internet and things deep tech. I think I'll start with Kajsa. You were in the Dutch government, if I'm correct, from 2017 until last year, which was a period when AI really came to the fore and to much greater public attention. Can you talk us through your perspective, both sort of domestic security, international security, defense? How did AI come into the picture for you?
Yes, well, you're absolutely right. Good morning, everybody. Great to be here. And after this very knowledgeable panel on AI and the technique, I think it's good now to focus on the security part. And then, as you said, if you look back for the past 8 years, AI is becoming more dominant in the security area. As a Minister of the Interior, I was responsible for our intelligence service, for instance, but also infrastructure and the way critical infrastructure can be impacted by cyber attacks, etc. So it did become more important, more topical. But I think the war in Ukraine is what really changed things. It brought more geopolitical, strategical thinking into politics, into government, into the European Union. We started thinking not only of threats, but threats actually materializing, also in our European countries, not only in the war in Ukraine. And I think we started seeing AI more as a possibility, as a chance, as an opportunity, also for our armed forces as a combat multiplier or force multiplier, which could bring huge advantages to our armed forces, and also, in the planning field. So not only in the weapons and the capability, but also in military planning, for instance, it would be something that would add value in an enormous way, something that we'd never seen before. So one of the things that I've seen is that there has been perhaps too little understanding of what it really is. And I think, especially on the level of the people that have to take the decisions, well, not everybody has the background of the Finnish foreign minister, unfortunately, because that would probably be very helpful. So many people don't really understand what it is we are talking about. And I felt that it was helpful to illustrate what we're talking about. So AI is not something that's completely new and that you can just inject to whatever it is you're responsible for. So I always took the example of the Patriot missiles in Ukraine that were hugely successful against also ballistic missiles that Russians previously said were, they were invincible, you could not touch them. But the Patriots could. And why? Because they use AI. And it's very simple. Everybody understands that a human cannot act quickly enough, but the machine can, thanks to AI. So being very practical about that helps. And then, of course, you also have to point at the other side of the implications of AI in the military domain, which is, which we've also seen, unfortunately, in the war in Gaza, that when used in an offensive manner in the targeting process, which is also inevitable, we're seeing it's happening, it's going to be done. But it's not always very precise. So instead of having less casualties on the civilian side, it can also cause more casualties on the civilian side. So there are risks and there are opportunities. And I think it's the same problem as the panel discussed before. You want some type of regulation, but our regulatory processes are much slower than the pace in which AI in the military domain is evolving. And I think we've seen that in the war in Ukraine. We see it in all our countries. We see it in the thinking that we're having now in Europe. Well, we have to deal with the threats and the challenges in the current geopolitics. And the big question is, can we, as politicians and policymakers, can we adapt to the pace that is necessary in the technology domain?
That's a great setup for Benedicta, if I can come to you. The AI is so abstract and yet all-encompassing from the perspective of what is essentially the EU's foreign ministry. How do you intersect with this?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. I would add it's the foreign ministry, but it's also the defense ministry, so we look at it from different angles. We talked earlier about the AI Act and I would say, overall EU policies, which are, of course, hugely important. But, for example, security and defense is not part of the AI Act. So what do? We look specifically what are the threats, and then how can we respond? Kajsa, you mentioned very important threats. I think Ukraine is the best example of how to use AI in a way that it can help enhance basically the military operations. You understand much better the threats, you can respond much faster, the targeting is better, etc., etc. We also, if you look at broader issues like democracy, elections, for example, what we look at in my team is, for example, foreign information manipulation. We see how AI is used to basically amplify cyber attacks, to influence societies, democracies. We had so many important elections this year, more are to come. So that's something that we're deeply concerned of. We also see that in the end, it can be a very simple technology, right? I don't know if I find the example of Ukraine remarkable because I've visited certain drone manufacturing places, and there you see that it's basically a very simple body with a brain, I would call it, which is dual use. So sometimes they take it from toys, they change it a little bit, and then off the drone flies. And you can, of course, do that at home. So there's a very low barrier, meaning if we look at it, we also need to look at it in terms of preparedness for the population, which is a very important aspect. Finland is more advanced than many other European countries, but we need to see what is the threat to our own population, how can it be abused also internally. And as you said, it's a very broad field, so we are trying to structure it, and we just had a decision by member states to provide a roadmap, which essentially serves to map this big field, AI and security and defense, and also say what should happen next. And it has 4 main pillars. The first one is to understand the threats and challenges. The second one is to basically develop capabilities. There are different ways, I can talk about that later. Then global governance is, of course, important. As Kaiser said, we need regulation, the right one, but it's often an undefined field. And partnerships are, of course, hugely important. So these 4 pillars is what we are currently working on.
We'll come back to some of that. Leah and John, my sense is your jobs are the equivalent of when you're told, don't look into the sun, you spend your days staring into the sun. and you're looking straight at the threats. So maybe, Leah, I'll start with you, but what are you identifying out there as the threats to international security posed by AI?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, for having me. Thank you for chairing this panel. It's great to be here. I think that we try to think about it in 2 different ways. First, as the actual threats that are coming from integrating AI across all different sides of security ecosystem. But then there's also the side that we are increasingly seeing certain countries, we all know which ones, targeting the AI ecosystem in the US and in Europe. I'll start on the first, however, and I think it's already been brought up on this panel, but we're at a point where the barrier to entry for military applications of AI has really decreased. And I think a little too often in the space, we really think about military AI as exquisite capabilities. We have Terminator in mind, we have killer robots in mind, but actually what is most useful in military AI is not those very sophisticated systems. It's not going to be a state-of-the-art, very large model. It's going to be smaller, more tailored models that can work with more precise, limited data sets. So I think a really good example of this is a year ago in my lab, we found a Chinese data set that had links to Shanghai Tech University. And the data set was made up of images of US Arleigh Burke destroyers. And those are destroyers in the US that have Aegis components, so they have theater missile defense on them. And if you looked at the photos within this data set, it was exactly those components that were bounded boxed out. So someone somewhere was training a ship classifier model, presumably an image classifier model, on these US Navy ships. Immediately when you tell US governments about this, they freak out and think that, we've stumbled upon some secret piece of the Chinese military that's hanging out in a university. And as much as there is, close ties between different parts of the Chinese military and universities, we had to be really clear to our government counterparts that just because you find a military-adjacent data set or model in the wild today does not mean that it is some sophisticated government ploy. These sorts of data sets and these sorts of models can be developed by a good university lab And I can tell you that because when we found that data set, what we did is we trained our own models on that data set to get a sense of how good of a targeting algorithm you could build off of that. So just across the board, the capability that you need to use these systems is decreasing. More and more people can build them, more and more people can design them, and even if you can't, more and more models are available in the open source that can be pretty well adapted to military use cases. The data sets I described, we trained a ship classifier model on. You can very easily replicate a model that's used for monitoring illegal fishing to then monitor naval assets. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges right now, is that we're moving to a place where regulating and governing applications is really challenging because of just how widely accessible they are.
Yeah. I think a theme today is a question of how do you define international security in an era of AI? So John, maybe your perspective on this?
Well, you know, I mostly look at the cybersecurity perspective, and I actually have fairly good news. I think, you know, there's a big difference between what we talk about when we talk about sort of theoretical use cases and the reality of what we're actually seeing in the space, right? I've been doing cyber intelligence for a long time, and there's a world where a really, really smart hacker goes out to a conference and gives a presentation on a theoretical use case, and my customers get really upset and freaked out about it. And then there's years before we actually see it in the wild, right? And then there's years between that and when we see it at scale. I've heard of all kinds of really interesting theoretical use cases for AI, for cybersecurity applications. The reality is I know what the Russian intelligence services and the Chinese intelligence services and North Korean intelligence services and the Iranian intelligence services are actually doing, because we're tracking them. And we can see what they're doing. And so the reality is that what they're using AI for right now is they do a lot of reconnaissance work on it, sort of like as a beefed up open source research tool. We see them tweaking their code with it, right? So we know that this has obviously got applications in sort of the programming space. That they're no different. We can see them trying to use it on some of their malware. Sometimes they can get little pieces of that to work, but fortunately, the tools are sort of built to look for malicious uses like that, and so there is some barrier there. The biggest use case we've seen, and this has been going on for quite a few years now, is the ability to fabricate content. This would be your ability to create, fake pictures, create a really like a believable document, create fake audio and video. And the application, the major application here is two places. One is in social engineering. We can see them create these social engineering hooks that are more believable. North Koreans, for instance, are really early adopter of this. They're not as technically sophisticated as some of their peers, and so they spend a lot of time just sort of convincing people to open things. The other side of that is the information operations. So we can see, for instance, several different countries' information operations are making use of this fabricated content to sort of make more believable claims as part of their operations. That's the bad news. The good news is when it comes to information operations, it's even with this sort of fake believable content, that doesn't mean anybody's going to actually read your stuff, right? Just because you came up suddenly with an interesting picture doesn't mean you're going to be an influencer overnight, right? And these guys are actually, they're fighting a upward battle. Even with the AI help, you're essentially usually tied to a security service or an intelligence service, or you're a covert asset, and your whole job is to operate in public. And as soon as you get popular, you get noticed, right, and get taken down. And so it's really hard for these actors to even with that fuel to be very successful.
As a journalist, I'm not sure if I should take comfort that even malicious actors struggle with what we in the media now face of getting attention. In the first panel, we heard a lot about regulation. When it comes to these areas of security and defense, I'm curious for the panel, is regulation a benefit? Is it a safeguard? Or especially with international competition where some other countries are not regulating to the same extent, does it put, say, Europe at a not just competitive disadvantage, but strategic disadvantage versus, say, the United States and China? Maybe I'll do the panel backwards this time. So, John, you get the
well, I'm not a policy wonk. I'm an Intel person, but I'll tell you, I do spend a lot of time talking to CISOs, the Chief Information Security Officers at companies, and I went into a lot of these meetings with my own thoughts and what they worried about when it came to AI, and the number one concern that comes out of most of these meetings is we're afraid that we know that people are already using what they call shadow AI. This is also a term they used to, in the industry, they call it shadow IT, the idea that people are using sort of unsanctioned tools to do their job, right? That workers need these tools, and you can either use them within the system or they're just going to use them anyway. And I think that's always been really an important way to think about this problem is that the train has left the station, right? Even the security people have to recognize that the business and competitive need for these tools is already out there, and it's existential for the business side, right? And so we have to keep up with that existential problem, right? I'm finding myself it's not how to use this or whether or not to use this, it's how to use this safely, right? That's the conversation I have to have everywhere because they're already using it.
Leah?
Yeah, so going back to the theme of the challenges with the increased barriers to entry, I think particularly on the US side, the perspective over the past few years has been if we restrict access to top-performing compute, top-performing models, then we will prevent the most dangerous capabilities from proliferating. And unfortunately, I think that's increasingly an outdated idea. I think that we saw lots of this idea, reflected in the EU AI Act, but also in a lot of American legislation that tied larger models to being riskier. So that's when you get into the 1 billion parameter and 10 to the 25th flop count number for the EU AI Act. And then in the US, it was more 10 to the 26 flop counts and 10 billion parameters. If you go back a year and a half ago, those were sort of where governance measures were saying, if you exceed that, then you are a large model, we see you as more capable, we see you as more risky. And that was certainly true when, ChatGPT came onto the scene, when you saw the first models coming out of OpenAI, Anthropic, DeepMind, and all of them. But what it has done, I find, particularly in US governance conversations, is it has really convinced US policymakers that if something isn't big and very compute intensive, then it's not as concerning, which is very much no longer the case. I mean, some of the models I worry the most about right now is we're seeing really, really capable biological models that can do gene editing, de novo protein design, and they're small models. They're working on very well fine-tuned small data sets, and they're able to make changes that are, changes that can really just change the biological makeup of different organisms. With that understanding of smaller, more distributed models, it then doesn't make sense to spend so much of your governance capital trying to prevent certain countries from accessing top-performing chips. I think the diffusion rule that we've seen come out of the US government, which sets different countries into different tiers of access, really falls into that loophole of thinking that the way of preventing the Chinese military, and this has been a stated goal of US export controls, is preventing the Chinese military from developing more effective military AI. But H100s are really useful, NVIDIA H100s are really useful to the Chinese domestic AI industry. They're not the determining factor into how and where you're integrating military AI. So I think that's my biggest gripe with the governance space right now. This is not some sort of sophisticated nuclear weapons-like technology where you have immense barriers to entry that are really easy to regulate or limit on a domestic and international level. This is a much more difficult thing to contain, and I don't want us, particularly right now in the US, to be more difficult in our alliances for something that in the end is not going to help us maintain a competitive edge that we're increasingly losing.
Benedicta, you're from part of the EU that is not a regulator, you're an actor. So what's your view on this?
Well, I mean, in the end, I think it's all about keeping the right balance between regulating and allowing innovation and security and also ethics, right? If I look at, for example, the military aspects and security aspects, and I think you also need to look at the different layers of regulation, because what my team, for example, does is the negotiations at UN level about responsible state behavior. And there we cooperate very closely with tech companies who are part of our delegations or the delegations of the member states, who are very important advisors because they tell us what the latest technology is, what the potential threats and risks are, what we need to look out for, what needs to be regulated. So I think it's also about how we come to these regulations. And I think that talking closely with the private sector, with the companies is very beneficial. And then also, I mean, you can see at UN level, there have been quite a few resolutions lately on AI, so you can see that there's a big demand on understanding the field and to some extent, of course, regulating it. I wouldn't want to imagine an AI field that is unregulated, especially when it comes, for example, to the lethal autonomous weapon systems. That's one that I think is self-explanatory, that it's important to understand how can it be used and what form of control, if you wish, do we want to maintain. So the important thing is that we talk to partners, that we develop a common understanding, and that is of course between the private sector and governments, as I said, but it's also in the international field. So we are spending a lot of time talking to basically countries all around the world to foster a similar understanding, which you can imagine is quite difficult, but I think that's exactly what we need to do in order to come to agreements that, well, ideally help us all, or at least push us into the right direction.
Kaisa, you had to live with regulation, but also probably develop some of it. So
yeah. Well, I think Benedicta touched on a very important point, which is if you want to regulate, you have to understand it first. So you have to engage with the platforms, the tech companies to understand that. You have to look at on what level. So ideally, it's the global level. So really, the UN is the right platform. And I think if you look from a European perspective, it could be an advantage that the European Union is a good regulator if they do the right type of regulation in this case. And I think we're really not there because of what I just said, the speed of the developments in AI, working on something humanity's been working on since the 50s, but it's now finally, becoming an enabler that is going to be everywhere, or already is everywhere. And when it comes to Europe, I think that rightly it was mentioned in the previous panel, we would want to have a single market. If you want European Union to become a global player in this field, you need at least a single market in this area. Also, on the military side and the military capabilities, we don't have that. So there is no single defense market because it's national. And that is something we have to overcome, probably not by waiting for the creation of the single market, but by working around it. I think that's extremely important. And also for the decision makers to understand what type of conversation do we need to have. So we don't want to have the conversation on the human in the loop or the human control. We want to have the conversation of what is actually happening today. We have to understand that the new technology is already used large scale in, for instance, the war in Ukraine. We have to understand that China is ahead of us when it comes to the implications of AI in their military domain, that swarm technologies are already there in the Chinese armed forces. And that's what we have to relate to. And I think you often hear, it was mentioned here also in the comparison with nuclear, the Oppenheimer moment. One of the things that I would worry about is that nuclear is at least a very complicated technology. It took a very long time for those countries that did build it eventually or are still trying to. It takes a very long time. But AI, once you get it, it's quite easy to copy. I think that's also the DeepSeek lesson that we've learned. And there is a big danger in that, and that's why we have to keep talking about engaging on the regulatory side, but at the same time not stopping the innovation, because that, at least for Europe, that means we're losing out.
Maybe we'll take one question from the audience. Woman here. Over this way. If you could identify yourself. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Krista Lagus from University of Helsinki. Thank you for all the panelists. The question that I have relates to data. Could it be possible or thinkable that we could govern the rights to data or notice the value of data and consider this in relation to human rights and the civil rights and citizens' rights? So I'm thinking that many of these threats relate to humans in specific ways, like the protein sequences, how they can, or the kind of applications, how can our bodies be changed. So that is clearly a very data threat to us. So, and also we have privacy concerns that are central to the humans. So if we consider the power not only in terms of power of companies or private sector versus power of governments, but the third entity, power of individuals, citizens, could there be kind of new types of solutions while we give human rights in this?
Maybe we'll take one more question and then let the panel grab. Does anybody else have here?
My name is Irina Kupiainen and I represent CSC and also the Lumi supercomputer. And I would also like to make a connection to the fireside chat and link this to the competitiveness question, which I think it's really relevant for security, as well as the kind of direct security threats that you have been addressing here. So the question of human talent, human capital, how to develop sufficient understanding, a comprehensive understanding across different fields, in addition to the advanced tech skills that are needed for the future, but also in basically all fields of education, research, and a kind of overarching understanding that is needed to address AI.
Thank you. So two very human-focused questions there. Maybe, Kaisa, do you want to start with wherever you want to tackle some of that?
I don't want to repeat what was already said also by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland, because I think that was very spot on. I think on that aspect, perhaps we could turn that into an advantage in Europe, because I think we have a very deep understanding of the protection of privacy, of our individual rights. I think we have a deep sense of what democracy means or should mean, or what we want it to mean, which is the fact that you as an individual are protected by the state, and that we respect that. And that distinguishes us from authoritarian regimes, and that I think that is a big difference and something that we should use to our big advantage. And I think the second part, and that also relates to the second question, we are here in this particular space, and I think that says it all. We focus very much in all European countries on education, on developing your individual specific skill set. There's a lot of room up for that. We try to create a lot of room for that. And that's also a unique asset that we could use in Europe if we continue to do that. I think there Finland also is an example for many other European countries, which we could turn in something that is extremely valuable in the future. But then we have to solve the other issues as well. So if we have all of that, but we don't find the single market, we don't find the means to create real access to finance, which I think one of the main stumbling blocks at this moment. If we use it in the wrong way, which is we make it too difficult to access to data, then those companies will never thrive here. Then we will have perhaps a few startups, scale-ups, etc., that grow in Europe, but not enough. Then we cannot compete. So it has a good side, and it has a side that hinders us, I think, on both aspects.
Thanks. Benedicta?
Yeah, maybe I take the second question and develop it a little bit further to what is more familiar with me, because of course we don't deal directly with education, but we look very much into what basically Kaiser ended with, what do we need to do in Europe to be, basically to have the capabilities that we need. And next week, the white paper for the defense of Europe will come out, and there we address exactly these questions: single market for defense, funding for defense. There's a European Council next week where we hope to have important decisions on this. And then the question will, of course, be how will this money be spent? And we already have certain programs where we invest in research, for example, so through the Horizon Europe, through the European Defence Fund, for example. We have different programs like the innovation program in the European Defence Agency, etc. So we are fully aware that we need to create a climate through, for example, funding and different kinds of incentives and enablements that allow startups to grow and that allow basically companies to develop further. And we see that whatever program we put on the table, whatever incentive we put on the table, that is always used. So there's a huge demand, and we hope that from next week on we also get an even bigger boost, for example, in the options that we have or in the incentives that we can put. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, two excellent questions. We'll start on the data one, which is very fun for me because we at the lab actually wrote a paper on data for the AI governance. So wonderful. I think data is a really interesting place to focus governance because there are so many existing regulations and laws that you can apply from day one without having to go through the challenge, which we currently have, of figuring out model governance. I'm not saying you should do one instead of the other. I think we need a bit of both. But there is an opportunity for us to more consistently apply regulations when it comes to copyright material, when it comes to harmful material, when it comes to classified material. That's a big conversation we're having in the US. When it comes to personal identification information, to sensitive health information, there are existing laws and regulations on that, and if we can, in the US and Europe, be better about applying those and potentially holding companies liable, that then incentivizes the companies to be a lot more, to be a lot better about the way they build their data sets. Because to be completely honest, the way that most data sets are being built at the moment, and luckily, industry is starting to go more towards more accurate data sets, but originally it was just scraping the internet and getting whatever you can on the internet. And what is in the depths of the internet? Well, a bunch of things that we probably don't want going into our models. Not great out there. My neighbor here will tell you all the stuff that's on the internet that you don't want in there. So applying those, holding companies liable, that then encourages companies to build data auditing tools and to really see the importance of building those cleaner data sets. That is also useful for competitiveness. So getting to that second question, there are places in which regulation does help competitiveness. It is increasingly the case that better data sets, cleaner data sets are getting you to better model performance. That's one place where they intersect. And so I think making it clear to industry that governance can have competitive value, particularly right now in Silicon Valley, we're talking a lot about research security. there are security measures that we in the US communicate to US companies as being really important. It is both a national security value that your IP does not get stolen by China. It's also a business value. You don't want your IP being stolen by anyone. I mean, we've seen really impressive US startups suddenly lose a lot of value because IP got leaked. A competitor started up halfway across the world and took over their market share. And so I think there's a lot more intersections than I'm giving credit for, and mapping those out and having those conversations with industry is really important. And I will say, just to close, it is striking to me how much more willing at least the American tech industry has become to talk about security and to talk about research security, to talk about economic espionage and countermeasures just within the past 3 years. And so we can certainly take that opportunity and continue to have those conversations with them.
John, I think you get the final word here because we're bumping up against the all-important coffee break where we'll all get to continue these conversations. So,
just the security aspect of it, what you just briefly touched on there. There are vast differences in basically organizations' ability to secure your data, right? There are a lot of different security problems associated with AI. The first one is that whoever's holding that data, wherever that model is hosted, can it be targeted alone by an advanced threat actor, right? And that's absolutely a very realistic scenario from the state level. It's an incredibly realistic scenario from the criminal level, right? The way that most ransomware actors make their money now is not necessarily disruption. It's leaking data out into the world or extorting you for them not to do that. The next piece that we have to worry about is this concept of like prompt injections and jailbreaking. The only way to really prevent that is to have a really robust process where people, as they discover these things or these vulnerabilities, they can report them back in and action can be taken, right? And if you're dealing with an immature player without a robust system or basically a policy that allows people to come and report that stuff, they are not going to be able to action that, and those doors are going to be wide open. And you get from I told you about like things moving from theoretical to scaled up. That's when things make that movement, right? Because nobody was able to report it early, and they weren't prepared to take action, right? And so there's a real value there of having a mature security player who can take care of these things.
Thanks. I would love to be able to continue this conversation. It's fascinating. It's terrifying. I'm afraid if we kept going, none of us would sleep tonight. So unfortunately, we'll end this discussion here. I want to thank all the panelists, especially for bringing so many different perspectives. It's really been fascinating. We're going to take a coffee break now, and then we're going to come back and talk about the all-important subject of money and AI. So thank you very much. Thanks. Yeah, I'll just... Welcome back, everyone. Hope everyone had good conversations. There's only a little bit to talk about here, so this could easily be a full-day conference. So we will jump right into the next panel. Unfortunately, the last one, but we'll get a lot done. We've talked today about AI and data, and most people think that AI runs on data, but really it runs on money. And for example, we in the Wall Street Journal have had some articles recently about the cost of OpenAI's next version, and just eye-watering the amounts of money involved. So that's the broad theme we're going to talk about now, because it is the enabler. We have an extremely prestigious panel yet again. To my left, Bengt Holmström is a Nobel laureate. We're thrilled to have you here, a professor of economics emeritus at MIT, and you have other hats you wear also. Ilkka, we've already met, and Juri Engström, who is managing partner at Lifeline Ventures and Yes VC. So very much, yet again, the business perspective. We've heard about the international competitive landscape initially from a international security perspective, but Bengt, maybe if we could start with you. A very simple question. Why has the EU fallen so far behind on AI? Or maybe we should flip it. Why have the US and China jumped so far ahead of Europe?
Yes, it's also often cast in terms of lagging productivity increase, and it was mentioned already. Here it has been stagnant for much of Europe, Finland in particular, but first thing to say is that Sweden, for instance, has followed pretty close to the US track. So Europe it's not one country, we tend to forget that, and it's not even a collection of states like in the United States. So Europe has challenges. I should say that yesterday there was a meeting with somewhat similar themes, and it is very impressive to see how much knowledge there is in Finland. I mean, it could have been a conference at MIT or something like that. It didn't sound any different, and the people were on top of things. So I assume the same applies if I were going somewhere else in Europe. So the question is, what does it mean if you fall behind in productivity? I'm not that much of a fan of productivity anymore, because we don't really know how we measure it, especially with these AIs and others. My late colleague, Bob Solow, quipped when computers came. He said, we see computers everywhere except in the productivity data. It was a big puzzle forever. Now we have the same thing with AI, or everybody is using it, and the mobile phones and so on, but we don't see it in the productivity data. My conclusion is there's something wrong with the productivity data, because obviously, in Africa, a smartphone is worth more to the people than is a water closet, and that tells you how much value people give it. So I just want to. There was somewhat of a negative tone listening to all the fears about data. This is a unique moment in humankind. We have never had such an opportunity that we have now. So I wish we would talk about opportunity much more, but I understand the topic was security. But we have, and we may come to the question also, who owns the data? And I take the view that in some cases it's the person, but in many cases it's the community or society that owns the data. So let me say just what the challenge is for the Europe that I think is somewhat shows up in the productivity, but it's really, you need to dig under it and see what is it exactly. And that the problem that we are trying to solve is how to transfer, legacy assets into, the future, new assets like AI and so on. That's the concrete problem. We are not per se interested in productivity. We are interested in how do we move from here to over there. US has been very successful in that regard in sectors, but it's still, in other sectors, it's very different. But these sizable valuations, we are talking about $17 trillion or more between the six. I say nowadays, I talk about the magnificent six, because one has dropped out. But that's, that, by the way, the first reaction is not, oh my God, what a horrible system that you concentrate. It is an indicator, just a small indication of the value of data for the rest of us. That's a flag that we have never seen before. And in this market cap, which I think is a more important signal, it shows that Europe, and it all has happened since the great financial crisis. So that is the challenge for Europe, of how to move it. And I will come back to that if you allow it to answer that question, I think. That's what I'm trying to do here. Tell you why, we could also say, why have Europe not advanced and US has advanced? And China, by the way, has also advanced. So I think understanding that is more valuable than staring at the productivity numbers.
Ilkka, so much innovation comes out of universities, but not every country profits from the innovation. You have a first-hand view of European university landscape and the US. Can you give some comparison, and how important is it to AI?
Yeah, it's a good, really, I think to the point question. There's a lot of idea. There are a lot of ideas, and now maybe coming. I'm not an expert in productivity, but looking at how we look the sort of development is that how in the kind of traditional companies how we can sort of improve the efficiency of an individual worker. But I think that what really drives this value of data is when you start reshaping the businesses. And I think I worked also in the Silicon Valley, so I think that one of the big differences is that when you look at how the sort of the new innovations come and really reshape efficiencies, they typically come through startups and new companies. And the culture of taking risks and really aim for scalability is something which is much weaker in the European side and much stronger in the US side. And this is, I think, one of the biggest differences I've seen. I've been very, very happy to see how, for example, the young Finnish generation of startup entrepreneurs have changed their attitudes. They've seen the world, and there's a lot of more of that attitude that really we aim for a really scalable business and are willing to take risks and investments. I think we're going to talk a little bit about what the circumstances there are, and do we have the environment here for that. But I think that the positive signal is that we do have a lot of young talent that's actually very ambitious.
Great. Juri, you see it as an investor, as a founder. Can you talk about the business environment from the business perspective, Europe versus the US?
Of course, Dan. As a venture capital investor, investing in both Europe and the United States, I see three important things happening right now. First is that European startups, particularly the AI startups, have been reliant on growth stage capital from US venture firms. And I think they can expect reduced investment from the leading US VCs. I was just in the US in the Bay Area last week, which is where I've been spending the last 15 years, and speaking with a number of my peers at leading US venture firms. What made me concerned for the first time is that I think I personally have been expecting the trend of increased US venture investment in Europe to continue. I can no longer say with confidence that that's going to happen. And the reason is that the leading US venture firms are laser focused on this new breed of AI-first companies that have emerged. And the VCs I spoke to last week in the Valley anticipate a resulting sharp decline in investment in Europe. One of them, I know for sure, has put a hold on all investments in Europe. And this is because essentially their game, our game in this business, relies on outlier companies. These funds are very large, multi-billion-dollar funds now. And they need an Uber, a Google, a Meta, an NVIDIA, an OpenAI level outcome in each of those funds. And essentially their belief right now is that the likelihood of one of these leading AI platforms to emerge out of Europe is zero. And the reason for this is pretty obvious. It's our own doing in Europe, largely because of GDPR and other restrictive AI regulations that directly impact our ability to build companies that collect data from across sources, and GDPR directly affects scraping the web, for instance. We just can't develop LLMs the way that our American and Chinese counterparts can at this point. And what it's leading to is that there's a significant number of the leading AI entrepreneurs from Europe who are now migrating to the US. 1 in 5 tech unicorns in the US today is founded by a European. And I think that we're going to see the leading AI companies that are started by Europeans, unfortunately, getting started in the US and not here because of this. So what Europe has to do is cut back on AI regulation. 50% of the founders in a recent study I saw believe that the new AI regulation in Europe, the AI Act, is further going to hinder our competitiveness. And on the other hand, we need to bolster our own investment in local European venture funds. If we can no longer rely on the growth capital to come from the United States, it has for all of the leading top AI companies in Europe, Mistral, Synthesis, all of these companies are essentially so far funded largely by US venture growth funds. And the last point is, what I fear is that Europe's strong labor protections are going to significantly slow AI adoption in European workplaces. And this is critical for these startups because they rely on early lead customers that are willing to invest in AI automation. And if you look at Manus, the new AI agents coming out of, I spent a day at OpenAI last week. These agents are no longer the way Peter Sarlin said limited AI that we're seeing right now that's doing generative AI for media creation. They use the computer on our behalf to fully automate human labor. And this is a big change. Really recommend listening to Mark Andreessen on a recent Lex Friedman podcast. I think it was dated January 26th. Go and listen to it on Spotify if you want to just understand this more deeply. A recent friend of mine said last week, this is like the Europeans are like a beach party on the beach who don't understand that the tsunami warnings just went off. 60 to 80% of all labor in Europe right now is being done on a computer. And what I think is going to happen is that anything that we do using a mouse is going to get automated by AI agents. And this means about 60 million jobs in Europe. I think that means that we're going to just have to cut back, allow investment, and reconsider how we deal with this automation part of the puzzle. I don't have the answers to that, but I can see that as a VC, we're going to have to double down and make sure that the top founders stay here and that we have the available funding to back them such that we don't end up, right now we're dealing with, our top companies here in Europe. All of them have top US VCs, growth investors, on their boards. They are discussing moving to the US because they are concerned that they are going to, lose out on the ability to return their funds with these companies because they fear that they may not be able to go out and, essentially keep growing and be competitive here in Europe. This is really worrying. I wish I had better news.
And we thought the international security aspects were frightening. Bengt, as an economist, and from an economic perspective, is there any, if not hope, a diagnosis that can take things forward?
Yes, I think it's important to understand how this situation has developed for Europe, and so quickly in some sense, and it was part of what we just heard here, but I want to elaborate it. What you need is you have to find a way of either killing your legacy assets or then restructuring the legacy assets in major ways. It's an enormously difficult task to restructure. And the faster task is usually to just throw it out and start over. And then you have to have a way of starting over. So you're moving funds and assets from the old stuff into the new stuff. And basically the new stuff is what Yuri just talked about. It's the startup. That's the startup community, the universities and so on. And the legacy asset stuff, the interesting part of that and the big difference in some sense is that the legacy asset part is dealt with in the United States from externally. That is, it is the private equity. You talked about venture capitalists, but private equity is a massive organization by now. It has grown from the, say, late 70s into now to being 70% shadow banking, all these things. That's an external control on these companies. And they call the shots in some sense. And they, you have a company and it's public traded, you will be taken over if you don't sort of go in the right direction. So they have very aggressive, they are originally hostile takeovers, then friendly takeovers, then, but they kept restructuring all the way from the late 70s or early 80s into now. That's bad news, by the way, because it has taken a long time for the United States to create this incredible machinery in terms of finance. What is Europe doing? Basically, they have 70% is traditional banking. US, it's less than 30% now. It's all now market finance, not, regulated banking. And it's going to take a long time. Draghi has understood this very well and talks about it, but it will take a long time, is the main. China is an interesting case because it illustrates another aspect of this, which has, China didn't have any legacy assets. There was nothing they sort of inherited from the Mao era that was worth anything. So they started from scratch. And I tell you, when you start from scratch, it's infinitely easier to build. A clean plate for a new technology is just a wonderful combination. That's why the startup is so important, because they are starting from scratch. All these Alibabas, WeChat, within a span of 15, 20 years, they were up and running and had among the top, they were also in the top 10 in market cap. So you see it in Europe, in Estonia. Estonia didn't inherit anything worth anything from the Soviet. It didn't take them long, to be the leading IT. And so we have to understand clean slate is just incredibly important. We have to have a way of killing things, whereas Europe now is focused a lot on, let's keep them alive. That's the mentality of a big company. Let's keep it alive and let's save it. So you don't want to invest very much in there. And I wish we would have a private equity market, which we don't have. But Draghi made an important point now that we are going to invest a lot of money in defense. That is raw material for actually securitization, and securitization is going to become part. It's government money, when it's securitized, it feeds if you have a good private sector finance or develop a private sector finance. That will be a first step, as he said himself also, a first step towards actually improving. I think one of you mentioned I think you mentioned the importance of financial markets. But I try to open up. We hear just financial market is important, but doesn't mean anything. You have to go into and look at, this venture capital is one part of it. Private equity, absolutely central. That's why our venture capital, our companies don't go beyond. European companies go to America, because ultimately it's actually the private equity also that feeds into this whole system and allows it to scale up. And so I try to just open up that I think one needs to look at this whole picture, and the United States, maybe they were lucky, but I think they were smart to see that market finance is the way to go.
It is fascinating in Brussels here now. The debates, discussions around defense industry are revolving around something very boring: the capital markets union. And who would have thought that making artillery shells depends on something purely financial that's been debated for more than a decade? Ilkka, again, your perspective where the money meets the intellectual know-how. Europe has a great legacy of universities.
And I think that this capital and this dynamic transformations are key. But I think that one should not underestimate the value of talent, because really money doesn't move things, but people do. And how to make sure that we remain also attractive in this way, because also people move with the money. And there are a lot of things around that topic also, whether it's the young people, whether actually is the talent that is already in the companies, but how to upskill and reskill in these kinds of transformations, because you have to have that also in order to really bring and build successful companies.
Juri, I'm going to come to you, but afterwards I think I'll open it up to the audience. Juri, you were like the doctor who gives a worrying diagnosis. So, any thoughts on what needs to be done to tackle the diagnosis?
I don't know. I mean, I think as Europe, we're sort of like a contestant in a 100-meter sprint that's prepared by meticulously tying our shoelaces together. We have, we just talked about it. It started. Part of it is, interestingly, from Teuvo Kohonen's lab here. It's like, we have the algorithm development skills. It's just that we've sort of, or I don't know if you prefer a golf metaphor. It's like, we've sort of restricted ourselves. It's completely self-imposed. It's like we're playing a championship golf tournament and decided that because there's a risk that we might hit the ball into the parking lot and break someone's car window, we're not going to be using any drivers. We're only going to be using, irons and wedges to carefully push the ball forward, whereas, our American and Chinese friends are, making large swings with, and, covering vast distances as they advance on the field. And so we can easily fix this. It's just a question of whether we want to or not. And I think it starts from deregulating, frankly. And then secondly, by reducing our dependence on just expecting the US venture funds to fund our best companies and just do it ourselves.
In the audience, any questions? Really? One from someone who's asked already, so I'd like to open it up more. Okay, we have a gentleman back here.
Thanks, Aro Suominen from VTT. Interesting question on the deregulation. How will that then help European companies particularly? Are we just opening doors for others to come here then, rather than building our own capabilities?
Can I quickly answer that?
Yeah, sure.
Let the Nobel laureates take over. Look, I don't know. I have a Tesla here and in the U.S. God, whatever. I beg for forgiveness. But if you try driving that car, the same car, it's a completely different experience, night and day, in the U.S. versus here. And the reason is that Tesla's self-driving has just gotten so good that you can let the car drive itself without touching it all the way from LA to San Francisco, touching the steering wheel. Versus here, and this is, this is the kind of, it may sound inconsequential and irrelevant, but now if you're an AI developer in Europe today, that's what it feels like, because you can't rely on access to the leading edge models the way that you can in the US. And I think what directly it's going to impact is, we're going to see people using tools developed in the US here. The companies like Meta, OpenAI, they're not sure if they should release their models, most advanced models here, because Meta already pulled back a model. They have probably the most capability, in addition to Google, to actually deal with European regulators. If you're a startup like Anthropic or OpenAI, you really don't want that to slow you down. So maybe you just avoid that risk and restrict access here, which is really bad if you're a developer relying on those tools over here in Europe. So I think it will just pulling back on these restrictions will free up the market to do its work.
Any other panel? Do you want to? Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, over here.
Yes, Alex Backlä, machine learning math student from Aalto. I'm wondering, well, I guess we need the regulation or deregulation and also the courage and will to actually do things. But I'm wondering from your perspective, what are the actual competitive advantage edges that Europe has, and how could we leverage those to actually build a better future for Europe?
Thanks.
Yeah, I think we have talent, we have skills. I mean, it's repeated so many times, it's a platitude to say now, but we don't make the best of them in many ways, I think. And so let me bring a surprising observation, because I think Yuri already answered the question about regulation. And that is that we don't invest in our undergraduates. In the US, if you go to a US university, Harvard or MIT, or you ask who is the most important customer, we use the word customer for students. Here one can't say customer because they are co-something or another, but they are customers. And who are the most important undergraduates? We spend a lot of time in the undergrad. That's our leading programs in all the universities. We would never let them just drift around and trying to find their way somehow to something. It's just an incredible amount of waste, in my view, in happening here in Europe. That they last long, they stay long, they are not nurtured, they are not helped to find, they are helped to discover what they are interested in and what they are good at and so on. That's the whole task of the whole university. That's the single most important task. That's why we exist. Yes, we do some research also, but nurturing these students along and into life is our really important. It's a little parallel to the venture capital we were talking about. We have just abdicated things to the students. We are asking them questions instead of saying, here's our offering. If you don't like it, go somewhere else. And that's, of course, had to do with the fact that it's not a competitive industry. But I can't overemphasize. You know, you look at who you look at Bill Gates, you look at Zuckerberg, and so on. They all left as undergraduates. They were not, you know, going to some Harvard level and then they became inventors or whatever. They were undergraduates. 4 of the 6 were quit actually from, I guess Zuckerberg didn't, so 3. So do you see undergraduate programs? From day 1 at MIT, they are getting into research. We hire them, you know, as undergraduates into our research because they get excited. And so this is the message. I'm sitting here in my former, I was also a student here, and I'm thinking, I wish, and I know actually we are taught Ilkka, Aalto is doing something about this, but I think it should be throughout Europe and this bearing. So that would be my comment on, you know, what to do about this situation, aside from the money. And one comment on the money. Money is nothing. It has to be in the right hands, the money. So it's you know, knowledge and money is the combination. So, you know, we give as much money as a government, you know, European governments, into research as does the United States. The big difference is the private side. That's where there's just a gigantic difference. And it all has happened in the last, I would say, 15 years at most. Market cap in Europe of the 100 biggest companies was bigger in 2007 than in the United States. Now it's 1/6 of the United States. All happened in 15 years.
I'm curious, there's in the US now questions about, you know, does business play too big a role in government? You know, look at some of the people very close to the president. The flip side of the question might be, does business play a big enough role in government and regulation in Europe? Ilkka?
I think it's sort of Europe is not one single country, so there might be a lot of differences. I think that there are good connections, and in a small country like Finland, we do get the inputs and the ideas. The question, of course, is sort of, can we not seize the opportunity and do the necessary things? I think that in a sort of a fast-moving area like AI, we're not done in any way. So this is not the end story, but the development goes really fast forward, and the only way to be able to be in that game, you know, besides the regulation and is actually to have the talent, do the fundamental research, have exciting developments, and they will change the game in one way or the other. But I don't know. I think that what is difficult in the European situation is this kind of how to seize the opportunity and actually take the bold decisions, whether it's reshaping the businesses or actually putting the public funding in place when it needed.
Before I come to you, I just want to cross the line beyond moderator. One big factor in the US is university endowments, which are incredibly wealthy now. And they exist in the US and not in Europe because of a tax law change in 1998 that allowed universities and professors to profit from research. And that has been a huge force in venture capital, you know, because university endowments are big funders of venture capital. And it has been such a virtuous cycle on the financing and business development side. But I'm curious, you know, in Europe, that kind of thinking doesn't seem to get traction.
Partly, I think, for example, in Finland, we made actually a very bold move in 2010 when actually all the universities were detached from the state. So we're private legal entities. For example, Aalto is a foundation-based university. We do have an endowment. It's actually a big part of our operations. About 10% of our total budget is actually coming from the returns of the endowment, and donations play a big role. But this is an exception. Typically, sort of because we are in a situation or in a sort of a systems where, let's say, taxpayers are paying quite a big part of the education of our youngsters, which gives accessibility to that and actually gives. I think that there are benefits for that, but then there's with this, the regulation comes into play. So I think this is something that perhaps we should think about more carefully in Europe. But I think we took a really big step already 15 years ago in Finland about that.
I don't know. In answer to your original question, Dan, does business play a role in European government? Yeah, I think it plays a big role, but it's the wrong businesses.
Legacy,
I missed that.
the word legacy comes back.
Sure, I mean, look, it's like, top 20 most valuable companies locally here in Finland, none of them, one of them was founded in the 2000s, and that's Cargotec, and it was just split off of Kone, which is a 100-year-old company. 11 of those 20 were founded over 100 years ago. We just don't have, look at that, you mentioned the Magnificent Six. We need these companies that are small, but growing rapidly and have high growth potential to be regarded as equally, if not more important, and their needs equally, if not more important than the needs of the legacy companies. And this is the fundamental difference in thinking, I think, between the United States and Europe.
Yes, I should say that. How do they restructure in Europe? The companies meander. That is, Nokia is 140 years old. It has reinvented itself many times over. In the US, the private equity guys would come and say, give us the money, we run you down, and we move the money where we think is the best. So it's the likelihood that the company guys who were running will invent the right things, and they certainly will not start with a clean slate. That's where the problem is. That's not a very efficient way to, live and reinvent yourself all the time, because you don't have the best ideas necessarily inside the company. And that's why the outsiders moving this is so much more efficient. And like you say, clean slate, under 50, all of them, new industries. I mean, we have still, what is the top 3 in Europe are still auto, in somewhat different orders. I mean, this is really a talk about legacy assets. I mean, it's like chewing on some kind of rubber in your mouth and trying to swallow it.
I'll give you one bit of hope, not to give advertising, but there's a company that is a leader now in 3D printing. It's British, it's not EU, called GKN, and it got its start making cannonballs for Wellington, used against Napoleon, and it has reinvented itself dozens of times. So
maybe
it
it
is
should
possible.
go back to its original business. I hear defense industry is booming.
Sadly, I think we're going to have to wind up soon, but before we end, maybe I'll just give the panel last chance to, Yuri, any closing comments?
Yeah, let's just get this thing going, guys. Come on.
Ilkka?
Maybe I'm a sort of the born optimist, but I think that there's much more cooking under the surface that we can see. Just to kind of throw some names, we have a really brilliant satellite company, ICEYE, which is growing, really creating a new business in Finland and growing very fast, out of startup. Quantum technology is something which has a sort of a 40-year legacy on this campus, really, and now we are getting finally very interesting things out of that. Bluefors is actually a leading cryostate company in the world. IQM is actually, if you look at superconducting quantum computers, one of the most interesting companies in the world. So there are things that are moving, but how to get these things, the real potential out of these, this is the question.
Bengt's closing words?
Two positives. One is that the US is shooting itself in the foot, so this is a chance to hire good talent and also catch up. There are good things. I would like to see Europe look, for instance, at CERN, which is one of the great success stories. So it's not like you cannot put a lot of money into some gadget and so on. So it's highly decentralized, as I understand it. That is, nobody sort of really in control. It's a collection of actually from different parts of Europe. I find it just amazing, how it's working, how well it's working, and I don't know why one can't sort of study that sufficiently to see how is this organized. I mean, there are thousands of people involved in this project, and they seem to be self-organized in some manner. And I think self-organization is a key word for the legacy assets. You can't run the big companies anymore the way they have from top down. You have to invent a language that makes these insiders talk to themselves in an efficient way. I think that's the secret of these 7, for instance. You look at Amazon or something like that. Bezos just defined a language. He said, now everybody uses API, and those who don't want to will be fired. Have a nice day. That was his famous email. And that changed it. But then he lets the guys do what they want with that language, the API language. So I think that's the way to deal with these legacy assets. Okay. But there are models.
Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, everybody, for questions, for being here. It has been a genuine pleasure and privilege to be here with you today. I've really enjoyed it. I hope everybody else has learned a lot. And thank you to Aalto University.
Thank you, Dan. I've been given the not-so-small task to wrap it up and sort of make a conclusion of the discussion what we have had here today. And let's see how it goes. But I would like to go back to this very building. Because I told in the beginning the architects were Raili and Reima Pietilä, and they based the whole structure on a pine cone. And you saw a sculpture of a pine cone outside when we entered. And why a pine cone? So of course, you go to artificial intelligence and you ask, what does a pine cone symbolize? And it symbolizes enlightenment and divine wisdom, adaptation and transformation, and renewal and resilience. I think that fits really good into the discussion what we had here today. And as a symbolization of what Aalto does at this very premise as well. A couple of personal reflections as well. I was struck what Bengt said about China and Ilkka about Estonia, that you start from nothing. In the early 90s, I backpacked in China, there for 9 weeks in total. And what really struck me was that when you had, you went to a rail yard, and the locomotives that changed the tracks at the rail yard, they were steam locomotives in the early 90s. Steam. And look at China today, and all the high-tech trains that go forth and so forth. Another takeaway from today is also that AI alone is not really so much, but AI and a human being changes everything when you combine these two together. Another takeaway, of course, is the European Union and what's been going on here. I mean, being a politician in today's world, it's not really an easy thing. People demand an easy answer to all the problems that we have. They are complex. It's insecurity, inconsistency, instability. But the people want an easy answer that is applicable tomorrow. So I'm happy that I'm a diplomat and not a politician in many ways. But coming then to EU, I mean, the EU has a lot of homework to do, but my job is also to be the eternal optimist in many times. Looking at the EU has always developed through crises, right? Let's not waste a good crisis. Let's utilize it and take advantage of it, because that's the way we can push forward so many issues on these things. But digital technology has brought us all together, regardless of where we are in the world. But like every technological tool we built, it's applied by humans, by us, creating a better future for everyone, everywhere. Thank you all for your insights, for your contributions, for the discussion. I think it's been a lovely interaction in so many different ways, raising questions, raising values, predictions about the future, where we can go. The conversation does not end here. So let's continue and shape the AI-driven future that serves us all. Thank you very much.